Chapter 15, Beyond the Archons. What happens when a lesson is completed? If reality functions as a curriculum, then one of the most important questions naturally follows. What happens when the lesson has been learned? If limitation exists for a purpose, what happens when that purpose is no longer required? If karmic circumstances correspond to the present structure of consciousness, what happens when that structure changes? And if archons are understood as administrators of lawful order rather than cosmic jailers, what happens when consciousness no longer requires the same degree of administration? The answer proposed by this framework is surprisingly simple. The relationship changes. Graduation does not necessarily mean that reality disappears. It does not require the destruction of the system. It does not require defeating the forces that once appeared restrictive. The student simply becomes capable of functioning within a larger field. Consider the difference between a child and an adult. A child may require boundaries that would be unnecessary for an adult. The boundary was not necessarily an enemy. It existed because the capacity of the child required it. As understanding develops, the same boundary may become unnecessary. This principle can be extended into the spiritual domain. A consciousness operating through strong attachment may require circumstances that expose attachment. A consciousness dominated by fear may repeatedly encounter conditions that reveal fear. A consciousness dependent upon external validation may experience circumstances that force it to discover an internal source of stability. A consciousness identified with control may encounter situations in which control repeatedly fails. The curriculum is not necessarily asking, how can I escape this experience? It is asking, what capacity is this experience developing? Once that capacity is established, the same experience no longer serves the same function. The lesson has completed itself. This is why spiritual evolution may sometimes appear strangely uneventful. A person may suddenly realize that something which once dominated their life simply no longer has the same power. The temptation is still visible. The circumstance may still exist. The old pattern may still be recognizable, but something fundamental has changed. The consciousness no longer needs to engage with it in the same way. There is no dramatic battle, no cosmic explosion, no external announcement declaring that karma has been canceled. The structure simply loses relevance. The lesson has become understanding, and understanding changes what is necessary. Why restrictions naturally dissolve. A central principle of this book has been that limitation is functional. A boundary exists because something is not yet accessible. A restriction, therefore, should not automatically be interpreted as punishment. It may be a form of protection. It may preserve the integrity of a developmental process. It may prevent consciousness from accessing capacities it cannot yet properly integrate. This principle appears throughout Vedic cosmology. Access to higher states of consciousness is not simply a matter of wanting to enter them. The consciousness must be compatible with the field it enters. A particular loka represents more than a physical location. It can be understood as a field corresponding to a particular mode of consciousness. As consciousness changes, its compatibility changes. What was once inaccessible may become accessible. What was once overwhelming may become natural. What once required enormous preparation may eventually become the ordinary field of experience. The restriction has therefore not necessarily been removed. The consciousness has changed sufficiently that the restriction is no longer required. This is a subtle but important distinction. Imagine a person learning to swim. At first, the shallow end provides the appropriate environment. The depth is restricted. The person cannot safely enter deeper water because the necessary capacity has not yet developed. As skill increases, the boundary moves. Eventually, the swimmer can enter waters that would previously have been dangerous. The ocean itself did not become less oceanic. The swimmer became more capable. The same principle can be applied to consciousness. The higher field does not necessarily need to be forced open. Consciousness becomes capable of inhabiting it. This provides another interpretation of spiritual purification. Purification is not necessarily about becoming morally superior. It is about reducing the structures that make higher perception unstable or inaccessible. Attachment creates distortion. Fear creates distortion. Compulsion creates distortion. Identification creates distortion. When these structures weaken, perception becomes clearer. When perception becomes clearer, consciousness can sustain greater awareness. When consciousness can sustain greater awareness, previously inaccessible states become possible. Thus, restrictions dissolve naturally. They dissolve because their purpose has been fulfilled. This is why attempting to violently overcome spiritual boundaries can be counterproductive. If a boundary exists because consciousness lacks the capacity to safely integrate what lies beyond it, forcing access does not constitute graduation. It constitutes premature exposure. The mature path is different. Develop the capacity, integrate the lesson, expand the awareness, allow the boundary to become unnecessary. This is liberation without rebellion. Higher locus and expanded consciousness. Within Vedic cosmology, existence is not limited to the physical plane. The lokas describe a multidimensional structure of existence in which different realms correspond to different orders of consciousness. The exact cosmological interpretation of these realms varies across traditions and texts, but the underlying principle is remarkably consistent. Consciousness does not experience all levels of reality in the same way. There are fields associated with increasingly refined forms of existence. Buloka represents the embodied terrestrial field familiar to ordinary human experience. Beyond it are progressively subtler realms, described through systems that include Bhuvarloka, Svargaloka, Maharloka, Janaloka, Tapaloka, and Satyaloka. These should not necessarily be reduced to destinations somewhere in physical space. They can also be understood as structured domains of consciousness. Each represents a different relationship between awareness, form, desire, identity, knowledge, and subtle existence. From this perspective, spiritual evolution is not merely movement through geographical locations. It is movement through states and structures of consciousness. The consciousness that is heavily identified with physical survival experiences reality differently from the consciousness established in subtle perception. The consciousness dominated by desire experiences reality differently from the consciousness established in detachment. The consciousness seeking knowledge experiences reality differently from the consciousness established in direct realization. As consciousness expands, the field it can inhabit expands with it. This gives the concept of higher locus a deeper philosophical significance. They represent not simply higher places, they represent higher degrees of compatibility between consciousness and reality. The movement upward is therefore not fundamentally about traveling. It is about becoming capable of perceiving and sustaining increasingly subtle dimensions of existence. The journey is developmental. At lower stages, consciousness may require dense experience because dense experience provides strong feedback. The physical world is extraordinarily effective as a classroom. Actions have consequences. Bodies impose boundaries. Time creates sequence. Relationships create mirrors. Desire creates movement. Loss creates impermanence. Death creates urgency. The density of embodiment produces friction, and friction produces learning. As consciousness develops, increasingly subtle forms of learning may become possible. The same lesson no longer needs to be delivered through physical consequences. It can be understood through subtler perception. Eventually, direct insight can replace prolonged experience. This is one possible meaning of ascending through the locus. The curriculum becomes progressively less dependent upon dense external instruction because consciousness becomes increasingly capable of learning through awareness itself. This is not necessarily an escape from embodiment. It is an expansion beyond exclusive identification with embodiment. The physical world remains one field within a much larger architecture, and the more consciousness awakens to that architecture, the less it experiences itself as confined to any single layer of existence. Administration becomes unnecessary, where understanding exists. This brings us to the deeper meaning of the Archons. If Archons are understood as administrators of lawful order, then their function is not fundamentally to imprison consciousness. Their function is to maintain the conditions under which the system operates. An administrator becomes necessary where participants cannot yet fully regulate themselves. Rules are required because understanding is incomplete. Boundaries are required because capacity is incomplete. External structure is required because internal structure has not yet matured sufficiently. This principle can be observed throughout ordinary life. A child requires external rules, a student requires instruction, a novice requires supervision, an apprentice requires correction. A person learning a discipline initially depends upon structures that eventually become internalized. The mature practitioner does not need someone standing beside them at every moment saying, "Do this, do not do that." They have learned the principles deeply enough to govern their own conduct. The external administrator has become less necessary because the internal understanding has become stronger. This provides a profound interpretation of the relationship between consciousness and cosmic administration. The higher consciousness becomes, the less it requires external restriction. Not because the administrators have been defeated, because the consciousness has become compatible with the order they administer. This distinction completely changes the mythology of the Archons. The Archon is no longer the cosmic enemy standing between humanity and liberation. The Archon becomes part of the architecture through which consciousness is protected, directed, limited, and ultimately released into greater autonomy. The administrator does not need to disappear. The relationship with administration changes. At lower levels, law may be experienced as restriction. At higher levels, law is experienced as the natural order of one's own being. This is the movement from external discipline to internal alignment. Eventually, consciousness no longer needs to be forced into Dharma because it understands Dharma. It no longer needs to be restrained from destructive patterns because it has understood their consequences. It no longer needs to be prevented from entering unsuitable states because discernment itself provides the boundary. The law has moved inward. What was once externally imposed has become internally understood. This is genuine freedom. Freedom is not the absence of law. It is the absence of unconscious conflict with law. The person who understands gravity does not become free by denying gravity. They become capable of moving intelligently within it. Likewise, consciousness does not become liberated by escaping cosmic order. It becomes liberated through understanding cosmic order so deeply that resistance to it dissolves. This is why the highest spiritual traditions often place extraordinary emphasis on knowledge, not information, recognition, direct knowing, vidya, jnana, the removal of ignorance. When ignorance diminishes, the need for external correction diminishes with it. The curriculum becomes increasingly internal. The teacher becomes increasingly subtle. The boundary becomes increasingly transparent. And eventually, the student recognizes that what appeared to be an external authority was never separate from the lawful structure of reality itself. The end of the prison metaphor. At the beginning of this book, we encountered the image of the cosmic prison, humanity trapped inside an artificial world, archons standing at the gates, karma functioning as punishment, death representing another stage of captivity, liberation requiring escape from the system. But if the framework developed throughout these chapters is correct, the metaphor becomes increasingly inadequate. A prison exists primarily to confine. A curriculum exists primarily to develop. The two can contain similar structures. Both have boundaries, both regulate movement, both contain rules, both restrict certain behaviors, but their purposes are fundamentally different. The prison says, you are not allowed to leave. The curriculum says you are not yet ready for what lies beyond this boundary. Those statements may look similar from inside the boundary. Their meaning is completely different. The first produces resentment. The second produces inquiry. The first asks, who is imprisoning me? The second asks, what is being developed in me? That shift represents one of the deepest transformations in consciousness. The world does not necessarily need to become different before it can be experienced differently. The interpretation of the structure changes because consciousness has developed enough to see its function. This is not an argument for accepting every circumstance passively. The curriculum model does not eliminate discernment. It makes discernment more important. If something is harmful, it can be opposed. If something is unjust, it can be corrected. If something is destructive, it can be abandoned. But these actions no longer require hatred of existence itself. One can act without believing that reality is fundamentally hostile. One can resist a particular condition without turning resistance into a worldview. One can leave a situation without declaring the universe to be a prison. This is the maturity of the curriculum perspective. It permits action without cosmic resentment. It permits discernment without paranoia. It permits responsibility without self-blame. It permits surrender without passivity. And it permits liberation without requiring an enemy. Graduation then is not a single event. It is a process of becoming increasingly unnecessary to the structures that once had to govern consciousness externally. The boundary becomes unnecessary. The lesson becomes integrated. The pattern stops repeating. The friction diminishes. Perception expands. Discernment becomes natural. Consciousness becomes increasingly capable of regulating itself. And what once appeared to be an external authority becomes recognized as the lawful architecture within which consciousness was developing all along. The student does not destroy the school. The student outgrows the classroom. And even this metaphor has limits, because consciousness does not necessarily leave one school and enter another in a simple linear progression. The deeper movement may be from identification with form toward recognition of the awareness underlying form, from dense experience toward subtle experience, from reaction toward observation, from observation toward understanding, from understanding toward realization, from realization toward identity with that which was never bound by the curriculum in the first place. This is where the distinction between development and liberation becomes especially important. The developing personality moves through lessons. The deeper self is not ultimately created by those lessons. The curriculum changes the instrument through which consciousness expresses itself. It refines the mind, purifies perception, dissolves conditioning, expands capacity. But beneath these changes is the possibility of recognizing that the witnessing consciousness was never truly imprisoned in the manner imagined. The prison belonged to identification. The curriculum belonged to manifestation. The self, in the deepest Indic understanding, is beyond both. This gives the entire journey a different meaning. The purpose of the curriculum was never to manufacture divinity. It was to remove the obscurations preventing divinity from being recognized. The purpose of karma was never to punish consciousness. It was to reveal the consequences of identification and action. The purpose of limitation was never simply to restrict. It was to create the conditions in which development could occur. The purpose of the Archons was never necessarily to prevent liberation. Within this philosophical model, their administration maintains the order through which liberation becomes possible. And when understanding becomes sufficiently complete, the relationship with that administration changes. The gate no longer needs to be forced open. There is no enemy to defeat. There is no prison wall demanding destruction. There is simply a consciousness that has become capable of moving beyond the boundary that once defined its world. This is graduation. Not escape from reality, but expansion beyond the perception that reality was ever merely a prison. Beyond the curriculum. There is perhaps one final paradox. If the universe is a curriculum, then the ultimate goal cannot simply be to become the perfect student. At some point, even the identity of being a student must be released. Otherwise, the curriculum continues indefinitely. One lesson becomes another. One loka becomes another. One attainment becomes another. One spiritual identity replaces another. The seeker becomes attached to seeking. The student becomes attached to graduating. The liberated person becomes attached to being liberated. The mind can turn anything into another identity. The deepest liberation, therefore, lies beyond the accumulation of spiritual achievements. It is not about becoming increasingly impressive within the cosmic hierarchy. It is about recognizing what remains when every acquired identity is examined. The body changes. The mind changes. Perceptions change. Circumstances change. Karmic patterns change. States of consciousness change. Locus may change. The role consciousness occupies changes, yet there is an awareness in which these changes are known. The traditions of Advaita Vedanta point toward this distinction through the recognition of Atman as fundamentally distinct from the changing modifications of experience. The curriculum belongs to the realm of becoming. The self belongs to the realm of being. The journey through limitation may therefore culminate in a recognition that what was seeking liberation was itself an expression appearing within something that was never ultimately bound. This does not invalidate the journey, it completes it. The curriculum was real at the level at which development occurred. The lessons mattered. The suffering mattered. The relationships mattered. The choices mattered. The integration mattered. But their ultimate purpose was not to construct a perfect prisoner. It was to awaken consciousness to what lies beyond identification with the conditions of the curriculum. And perhaps this is the final meaning of the title of this book, From Limitation to Liberation, not from one physical location to another, not from Earth to somewhere else, not from imprisonment to geographical escape, but from unconscious identification with limitation toward recognition of the consciousness that can witness limitation without being completely defined by it. The boundary served its purpose. The lesson was learned. The friction became understanding. The understanding became integration. The integration became expansion. And expansion revealed something extraordinary. The path to liberation was never necessarily about destroying the architecture of existence. It was about understanding why the architecture existed. Once that understanding becomes complete, the walls no longer look like walls. They become thresholds. And the threshold no longer asks, how do I escape? It asks, what am I now capable of seeing? That is the final movement beyond the Archons, beyond resistance, beyond fear, beyond the identity of the prisoner, beyond even the identity of the student, into the recognition of consciousness itself.